This is Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clement Center for National Security here at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm honored to introduce our two speakers today, Jamie Fly and Laura Rosenberger, both of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Jamie and Laura both bring a distinguished background in national security policy to their current roles. Jamie was a senior Pentagon and National Security Council staff member in the Bush administration, as well as for Senator Marco Rubio on Capitol Hill. And Laura held senior positions at the State Department and National Security Council in the Obama administration. And they're going to be talking to us about their very strategic work on authoritarian interference in democracies, especially Russia's ongoing information operations against the United States.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to be with us today, and to Will and the Clement Center for hosting us here. We're really thrilled to be here in Austin and to be talking to you about these issues. As you heard from Will, I think one of the things that Jamie and I often emphasize about the work that we're doing is the bipartisanship of this. And let me just kind of start there for just a second. When we launched this program together about a year and a half ago, there were a few things that we felt were really important to doing this work, and the bipartisanship was really front and center. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that, for us, democracy should not be a partisan issue. Protecting our democracy should not be a partisan issue. And frankly, if we can't agree as Republicans and Democrats across party lines that we should be protecting our democracy, I'm not really quite sure what else we can agree on. I also, we both come out of the national security world, as you heard from Will, and I think for both of us, I certainly can speak for myself here. National security also has always felt to me like one of these issues that should not really be defined by partisanship. We may disagree at times on tactical pieces, but our country's security, again, is not something that should be a partisan football. And so this program that we launched is bipartisan by definition. It's also transatlantic. When we were really thinking in the sort of aftermath of the 2016 elections and looking at sort of the attack that had been launched on our country and on our democracy by Russia, thinking about the fact that for many of us, we felt a little caught off guard that Russia had brought these tactics to our shores. But looking across Europe, we were all too familiar and knew our European partners and allies were all too familiar with the use of these tactics across the European landscape. And frankly, I think Jamie and I feel that in retrospect, there were probably policy and analytic failures on both sides of the policy community and national security community that were a bit naive about what Putin's ambitions were, and too often looked at this as an over-there challenge rather than one that was a potentially direct threat to our national security. So learning lessons from our European partners and allies and forging transatlantic strategies to be able to tackle these issues together is something that's also very much front and center in our work. So let me turn it over to Jamie if he wants to give a little bit more on sort of who we are and what we do, and then how we think about this problem set.
Thanks, Laura. So as Will said, I served in the Bush administration for 4 years and ran a think tank in Washington, then was working for Marco Rubio for 4 years, including through his presidential campaign. And although I had not met Laura at the time, we only met about, I think, 2 years ago when we both knew we were coming to GMF. The 2016 campaign, obviously having worked for someone who participated in it, was a formative experience for me on this issue. I think like many of us, many Americans, I think many people in the U.S. government in 2016, we really had no clue what was going on in the election and the full extent of the Russian effort at that time. I think looking back now, there were some hints and signs that were perhaps missed. I think they were missed in the U.S. government. They were missed by those of us on the various campaigns. But it was really after November 2016, and when I was still in the Senate for about another 6 or 7 months as a Senate staffer for Senator Rubio, where we were sitting in a lot of the briefings that were being provided by the outgoing Obama administration, by intelligence officials and others about their postmortem. What began to concern me is just as a Senate staffer, I began to not have a lot of confidence in the people who were presenting, even completely understanding what they were trying to present to the various oversight committees. There both was a lack of information, even at that point, probably several years after this effort had begun by Russia. Because of the nature of the threat, because this involves social media and in large part engagement in a U.S. election, these were issues that many of the analysts, my sense was, in the intelligence community had not really grappled with before. It almost, in some of these briefings, had the sense that I think has now been repeated several times in public hearings where you have senators questioning Mark Zuckerberg or tech executives about social media platforms that it's very apparent the senators have never been on. You were getting that vibe from some of the experts within the U.S. government whose job was to monitor these sorts of threats. And that was deeply concerning to me. And so when I met Laura and heard about her experiences on the other side of the aisle, it was a very compelling project to get involved in, and something that I really believed in the bipartisan nature of the required response. So I'm going to start by, I think, Laura, you have the clicker perhaps, by just providing a bit of an overview about the tools that we look at, and then I'll talk about the first one and then pass it to Laura. So a couple things. Laura already mentioned the transatlantic nature of our work, and you can see this here. This, and we'll use a couple of these screenshots, is from one of our products. We have an authoritarian interference tracker that we released several months ago. This is looking primarily at Russian activity. We hope to expand this over time to include other actors. One thing that we'll talk a lot about Russia today, partly because I think we're still in the lessons learned phase from 2016. But as a program, we're expanding to look at other actors. We have a China analyst on board now who's been with us for a few months. And the one thing I'd note there about the fact that this threat continues to broaden, which is very concerning, is we like to say that the Putin playbook is essentially now going global. Even in the time that we've started this project, you see more and more evidence that other actors like China, like Iran, are both trying to interfere in American democracy, and this has been validated in various U.S. government assessments that have been conducted since. You've seen activity from those actors in Europe and as well as other democracies. The really concerning thing for me as well, it's, I guess, not surprising that America's foes would try to adopt these tactics, is that you've even seen some U.S. allies and partners, non-democratic allies and partners, adopt these tactics, in particular in the Gulf. We can talk a little bit more about that if you want. But anyways, I think for us, that shows that we as a country, even though we've begun to grapple with this, have not made clear, both to friend and foe, that dabbling in this space is something that will be met with extreme significant consequences from the U.S. And so a failure to deter, I think, is incredibly dangerous. And that's something that we're very concerned about. So this map mainly shows Russian activity. And what we've tried to do through this is to show that this is a whole toolkit. There's a lot of focus on information operations, and we'll get into that in a minute. But this toolkit is quite broad. It involves things like political and social subversion, cyber attacks, malign finance, and strategic economic coercion, especially with our allies in Europe. You see a lot of this from the Russian playbook. And what we do on our tracker is we've gone through open source data and logged incidents over time and country by country, just to show that in almost every target country, you see signs of just about every one of these tools, which I don't think has been realized as much in the past, again, partly because of all the focus on social media and some of the things that played a significant role in 2016. And so when we'll end up talking about our policy response, we really feel that it's a broad-based policy response that tackles the full toolkit, not just focuses on one or other of the tools. And if you want to, this is an interactive map on our website. You can go to securingdemocracy.gmfus.org, and you can kind of click through it, and you can actually see the data set. You can see which incidents are highlighted there in each of the tools. So I'll head to information operations. And I'll just run through a couple slides. This is the similar slide of just targeted countries that have been affected by information operations. Again, these are Russia-focused operations. The main thing we see across the transatlantic democratic space is that these operations are attempting to exploit vulnerabilities in our societies. They're highly customized, even though they happen across all of these democracies. The surprising thing for me, as someone who had worked a little bit here and there on Russia, especially related to counterproliferation and arms control, I guess I underestimated the Russians' ability to to kind of drill down country by country to understand the political dynamics in each democracy are very different. The vulnerabilities are very different. So as we, setting this up at a transatlantic organization like GMF, which has 7 offices across Europe, started to engage our European partners, we found that when you went into each European country, you heard a different story when you looked at the examples of these operations over time. It was very rarely a one-size-fits-all approach. It was highly tailored to local controversies, to local vulnerabilities in those societies, the local ethnic group, which had really never gotten along with the general population. That would be the message that was pushed in that particular country. And so it's interesting if you look across this space, that also makes it difficult to respond to on a transatlantic basis, we found, because some countries just don't want to talk about it, even with other democratic allies. And we found this as we've engaged NATO, and we asked some questions early on. We briefed deputies at NATO very early on as we were setting up the project. We tried to inquire, well, how many briefings have you had at the North Atlantic Council about this issue? Did you have the U.S. administration come in and share examples of what happened in 2016? Did the French come in and talk about the recent French election of Macron and how what they saw on the ground and how they responded? And what we found is that most of these countries had not been willing to come brief all NATO allies. They were either because of sensitive intelligence concerns. Some of it, though, honestly, I think, is they preferred to deal with it in very quiet bilateral channels rather than airing the dirty laundry within their own societies, because in some of these cases, the Russians were exploiting issues that were thorny subjects for that particular government, and they didn't really want to air it in front of all the allies. On the next slide, so this talks about the broader goals of information operations. The key is devaluing the truth, dividing and conquer, undermining democratic institutions, and shaping opinion. They have multiple goals. It's not always pushing one particular Russian narrative, which I think is important, especially as we start to look at what other actors are doing. I think this is especially key with the Chinese right now. If you start to look at their influence operations in Europe and here in the U.S. through some of their overt media, it's a slightly different approach on this front. What the Russians more often have done, if you look at the data, is really just try to sow confusion about many issues. When there are strategic imperatives for them to engage on something like the Skripal poisoning in the UK, they will put out 10 different stories about what happened, knowing none of them are true, obviously, and the Russians aren't going to stick to one of those stories. They just want to sow confusion in a saturated media environment so that your passive kind of consumer of information will see at least several of these and at least have a seed of doubt planted about maybe the Western narrative, because obviously U.S. and its partners, or the British in this case, are trying to put out the facts, or at least their side of the story, and they're pushing one story. The Russians will push out 10 stories through their different channels and just sow confusion. A lot of what we've seen in our analysis of social media engagement by the Russians, both during 2016, and I'll show some of examples of that, and then others since, it's really just sowing division. I like to call it equal opportunity, in the sense that there's sometimes a narrative in our policy debates since 2016 that this is all about claiming the Russians are always on one side or the other, or the Russians are Republican now in the age of Trump. The reality is that if you look at the groups that they're infiltrating, the messages they're pushing, they're perfectly willing to infiltrate a group on the right, a group of progressives on the left, push a narrative that's appealing on one side or the other. We'll show some examples in a minute of them even going after candidate Trump, in some cases, going after Democrats many times as well. And so that's an important aspect of their messaging as well, which I don't think is fully understood by the broader American public right now in terms of what they do online. There's a lot of evidence of them pushing messages to just undermine faith and confidence in democratic institutions. It's everything from the voting system itself. There's obviously reporting by DHS about attempts to probe certain election systems in 2016. No evidence that any votes were changed or that they actually kind of got access to the voter rolls. But we've seen plenty of evidence both in 2016 and the run up to 2018. Well, I'm sure we'll see it in 2020. Just trying to convince many Americans that their vote doesn't count, so why bother voting, is one. There's been some analysis of even their efforts to undermine law enforcement, the FBI as part of kind of the debate about 2016, questioning intelligence community assessments, undermining the courts and the legal system. A lot of attacks on members of Congress of both parties as well, so casting doubt on Congress and its ability. So a lot of this, and there's a lot of evidence from 2016 of specific examples of them trying to dissuade especially Democratic voters from even bothering to show up to vote for Hillary Clinton, certain minority groups and pushing certain messages, trying to get them to stay at home or trying to sow confusion about which day the election was, or in one case, which I think the companies even had to take down, trying to convince people that you could just vote by retweeting a tweet. And so a lot of that, and there are obviously connections to dirty tricks which have been present in American politics and American elections for centuries, and so they've actually adopted some of those for the social media age and tried to push those as well. Finally, on shape opinion, the one interesting thing we have noted, especially on the kind of transatlantic issues, there are issues that they really care about, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Syria, where they do have a Russian narrative where they are trying to get that narrative out covertly. They certainly do that through RT and Sputnik and some of the more overt channels, but in the memes and the tweets and the other efforts on social media, you see many examples of them trying to convince Americans that, for instance, Macedonia should not join NATO and that Macedonia is just a financial burden on the U.S., so why should the U.S. get involved? We've also seen many disturbing messages related to just general perceptions of Europe and the U.S. So you'll see a lot of activity on social media pushing the notion that Europe is a terrorist wasteland filled with Muslim immigrants who are constantly blowing themselves up and conducting terrorist attacks, that it's not a safe place to travel to, that it's not a trustworthy partner. And then in Europe, if you look at their European networks, you see a similar version or tweaked at times to sometimes accommodate certain images of the Trump administration of the U.S. as an unreliable partner for Europe. They're really trying to split the alliance, drive Americans and Europeans apart. And so there are times when it's not just about sowing confusion, but actually with a clear strategic intent. And obviously the end goal at the end of the day is damaging democracy. We think some of this is just to distract, divide, make America and Europe more inward focused, which allows Russia more strategic space to accomplish some of its goals. The other thing clearly is Vladimir Putin is very interested in maintaining his grip on power. And if you have democracies in chaos across the European space, the EU fighting amongst itself, divides within NATO, the US distracted internally, it's a perfect foil for him to point to when he just addresses the Russian people and say, you really want democracy, look at the chaos that you see over there, because that's not what we have here. On some of the tactics, and I've described some of these tactics already, I'm not going to run through all of these examples, but we've taken just different screenshots. There's the one good thing now that we did not have when we started this is both through some of our work, but honestly, a lot of other civil society groups, some working on information made available by the tech companies, in part information that was kind of pooled begrudgingly from the tech companies by Congress as they started to do investigations. There are all kinds of open source databases now where the various examples of posts in the run-up to 2016 were highlighted. I think these are some of the ads that were actually purchased, which is only a small part of what we saw in the run-up to the election. Quite frankly, some of the content that got a lot more attention was the indigenous content that was just created, not because of ads that were purchased, but by fake accounts that appeared to be average Americans that then got shared on certain networks. And it's important to note that beyond the fake accounts, the ads, there are some bot networks. It's often working in combination as a certain ecosystem. I mean, we've found everything from fake websites that get set up that almost look like they're blogs run by people in the American South who have a particular viewpoint, that those links will then get shared through fake pages. There's, we don't know the full extent of this because not being at the tech companies, we don't know exactly how all the different algorithms work, but there's increasing evidence of gaming of algorithms on some of the platforms. Some of this plays out especially with platforms like YouTube, where there's been efforts to take RT-produced content, strip off the labeling, on particular topics, then post the videos that are sanitized. And when you Google certain topics, and I haven't done it recently, but I think it was things like NATO Ukraine, NATO Georgia.
White helmets.
White helmets was a big one, actually pushing their narrative on Syria. Within the top 5 results on YouTube, your average consumer of information would get several, often, videos that were actually Russian produced, but they would have had no clue. If you watch that video, you might be able to figure out from the narrative eventually if you're sophisticated about the topic, but there was no labeling, nothing like that. And some of that, it's very complex, but some of it, I think, links back. We later discovered that some of them were they were linking the algorithms back to activity on Twitter. And so if there was a certain level of activity around a certain video on Twitter, then maybe that video would end up higher in the results on YouTube. And so anyways, it's a massive problem, which the companies, I think, have now it's been made aware to them. It's unclear exactly what changes they have made, but we still see this happen on many issues, which is incredibly concerning. And then finally, the theft and release of compromising information, which we certainly saw in 2016 with the hacking of the DNC, the Podesta emails, essentially the weaponizing of the mainstream media, which we think doesn't get enough attention. One of the most effective information operations that they conducted was essentially by harnessing the power of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and all the major outlets who covered with a frenzy every single aspect related to these hacked emails without any ability to really determine the ultimate source of them, the agenda of that person. Even once it was revealed that this was a Russian intelligence operation, these outlets, for the most part, continued to report on this stuff. And many of the outlets had no ability to actually figure out whether the Russians had inserted any fake content into these emails, which is something we've seen them often do in other operations in Europe. And this hack and release is one of the disturbing things that we've seen proliferate. And I mentioned the Gulf partners. They have, the Emiratis, Saudis, Qataris have now been all engaging in this against each other, including getting into the accounts of some Americans who are on one side or the other of that dispute, and again, weaponizing the U.S. press to kind of carry out their intelligence operations. And so we've been doing some work on media ethics, talking to various journalists and news organizations about how to handle these challenges in the future, what questions should be asked, hopefully raising the bar of the decision to actually publish, making sure people try to figure out what is the ultimate agenda here of the original leaks and trying to verify the information before these sorts of operations are amplified in the American press. Do you want to add something? So then on the next slide, and some of this I already highlighted, inauthentic personas discussing relevant social political issues. I think these are some examples catering to both sides of the aisle. We've seen a lot of targeting of minority groups, African Americans. On the bottom left here, you see examples of even using some of the same narratives, mocking on one side Hillary Clinton and on the right side Donald Trump. So they'll even just repurpose and just slap a different image up there. On the lower right, this is an example that just was highlighted recently in a CNN story. Again, in the video space, this is an American who was putting out videos through a media company, which kind of was part American, part German, I think, but the media company did not disclose its Russian ties, its financial ties. There was a lot of activity on this account related to Venezuela recently, pushing certain narratives related to U.S. policy vis-a-vis Venezuela. And these videos actually kind of went viral in certain corners of the internet, especially with young people. And we've seen a kind of sophisticated targeting of different demographics rather than, again, a one-size-fits-all. They seem to realize that certain types of videos or certain types of messages need to be tailored for the audience that they're going for. I think finally on InfoOps, before I turn it back to Laura, this is a case that actually we highlight all the time, not just because we're in Texas, but it's another disturbing aspect of all of this. This was in May 2016, where they used two Facebook accounts, which gained a certain amount of following. One was called The Heart of Texas. The other was called United Muslims of America. They did this activity for several weeks, gathered followers to these Facebook pages, which were created by the Internet Research Agency, by people sitting in Russia. And they then advertised on both Facebook groups that a rally would take place on May 21st at 12 p.m. At the exact same location. And so they ended up getting Texans from both sides of this issue. And the heart of Texas was obviously more right-leaning. United Muslims of America was appealing to American Muslims. And it was related to a local Houston Islamic center kind of, I think, dispute about whether that center could have a certain location or certain activities. And they ended up, and there's a photo there at the top left of the people who actually showed up. And this was an entirely foreign manufactured effort on social media. Obviously, these Americans have every right to espouse whatever views they want in support of these pages. But these Americans were manipulated by people sitting thousands of miles away online to show up at the same day, same time. Our fear, and this was highlighted in Mueller and other investigations since, is that the goal there was to potentially create a violent incident where these people would show up, not knowing the other side was showing up at the same day and same time. Luckily, police were there, and as you can see, kept them on opposite sides of the street. Again, at that time, no one had any clue what had actually created all of this. And there were some local news accounts, if you go back, who were interviewing the various people, and no one quite knew who had started these groups. People just kind of saw them online, identified with the cause, and decided to take time out of their day to show up. And this is the story that's been repeated multiple times. Some of the Mueller indictments outlines other cases. There were several in Florida, closer to the actual election, where pro-Trump rallies were organized from overseas. And again, you had Americans who obviously they were Trump supporters, but they only kind of gathered on that date at that time because of this campaign from overseas. And the frightening thing for us is we've seen this both in these physical rallies, we've seen it online now, is some of the accounts that have been infiltrated and the groups that have been infiltrated go down when the tech companies do take action. Many Americans who are subject to these operations, they don't want to believe that they were manipulated. It's incredibly offensive to them at the end of the day. And you've seen this now as the journalists followed up on the Mueller indictments and interviewed some of the people who we know were at those rallies and said, why were you there? Did you know that this persona you were talking to is actually sitting thousands of miles away and is Russian? They still don't want to believe it. And so it's a broader problem that a lot of the reaction, especially those who have been manipulated the most, aren't willing to admit that it wasn't someone a town or two over that they thought was just a local organizer that brought them together, but it was someone with a foreign actor who had malign intent in doing so. So I'll turn it over to Laura to talk about some of the other tools.
Thanks. So I'm just going to add one last point on this piece of it because I think it's important. One of the things as I think have done all this analysis of what has been conducted to date in terms of these operations, I think it's really important that we not assume it will be exactly the same thing going forward. These tactics are evolving and they're evolving very rapidly. So in this space, in the kind of infiltration or creation of fake groups, recruitment of protests, all that, it's one area where we've seen a good bit of evolution. So whereas here, these were wholly fake groups created out of whole cloth, from trolls sitting in St. Petersburg. The tactics more recently have actually been, online personas, again, pretending to be Americans, but reaching out to real activists within the United States and saying, hey, we should put together this event or put together this group to do X, Y, and Z. And the activist thinks that they're engaging with another American. They're apparently online. Everything appears to be somebody who's very like-minded to them. And so then they'll put together something, put it up as an event or a protest or some kind of organization. And then what we saw actually in an example of this over the summer was Facebook detected some of this activity and took down a whole bunch of groups advertising for a protest that was called was countering Unite the Right 2. So it was the anniversary of Charlottesville. The Unite the Right groups were planning another white supremacist rally, and there were some groups that were organizing to counter that. Well, that included some groups that were a little bit more on, that seemed a little bit more on the fringe, maybe a little bit more toward a sort of violent tendency. Well, it turned out that when Facebook went in, they discovered some linkages with known personalities or accounts from the Internet Research Agency. They took down all of the groups that were basically part of this cluster, which included genuine real activists. And so what is really concerning to me as these tactics evolve is, and we'll talk in a minute about political and social subversion here, which we kind of think about in a whole separate category, but it's really related because my deep concern is that by hiding their origins online, these Russian operatives are basically able to not just manipulate our discourse, but they're actually denying activists free speech and free assembly in a way by attempting to manipulate what they do, what they say, and I think it has again significant implications for our democracy. If you go back to the goals that Jamie went through in that chart, it really has a real harmful effect on the basic functions of our democracy. If we can't be engaging in free speech and free assembly without manipulation taking place beneath it, I think that it's going to be really quite damaging. So it's something that I'm very concerned about. It's something especially, one of the other examples that was on one of the previous slides was the creation of a fake Black Lives Matter page. And again, we've seen a whole bunch of a whole cluster of accounts that were targeting, the Black activist community and trying to masquerade as activists. And again, I worry that it will have an effect on the ability of real, genuine activists within the United States to engage in exactly the kind of activity that's very important in our democracy. So I'm going to quickly breeze through some of these other tactics that Jamie mentioned in our initial slide, because I do think it's really important that we bear in mind that this is a whole toolkit approach. I was at the NSC at the National Security Council during the time of Russia's initial incursion into Ukraine, and one of the things that was very striking to me, sitting in the meetings we were having in the sit room at the time, the briefings we were getting from the intelligence community, it was very difficult for our analysts to put together the pieces of what was happening, because these were tools that aren't traditionally ones that that are thought about as, from the national security perspective, number one. Number two, these are tools that we kind of tend to look at in silos, right? So we have different parts of the government looking at different pieces of operations. And number three, they aren't really areas where we've mastered the policy responses, and we'll come back to that at the end. But I think it's really important that we be able to kind of think about the whole picture and how this toolkit, its component parts and how it all combines. So the cyber attacks piece, Jamie mentioned, of course, earlier the hacks on the DNC, on John Podesta's emails. Those obviously were weaponized as well in information operations. But we've had other cyber attacks, all across the transatlantic space. That sometimes simply just steal data and then use it potentially for other kinds of operations. Sometimes, there's been a good bit of concern about the election system itself, whether it's vulnerable. Of course, there is evidence in 2016 that some of the Russian hacking networks did at least probe the electoral systems. And I think that is an area where it is important that we continue to make sure that we harden those against any potential ability to manipulate the data. And I think it's one thing that we kind of don't think about as much as we should, is that it's not just the theft of data in cyber attacks that can be problematic, but you could actually have the ability to go in and manipulate the voter rolls to change my middle name from Michelle to Nicole or something, and I show up and I show my ID and it doesn't match, and at the very least, depending on what state I'm in, I've got to file a contested ballot, and you do that at enough scale and suddenly you can have real problems in the voting process. And again, part of the goal of the cyber attacks can also be simply undermining faith in government and institutions. So if, for instance, we look at some of the European countries where attacks have been carried out on the electric grid, and the government really simply isn't able to keep the lights on, that has again an eroding effect on democracy. Political and social subversion, which I mentioned earlier in the context of the activists, again, this is an area where I think there are a lot of examples across the European space of where either the Russian government and its proxies will either provide covert financial assistance to different groups, They will train some of these groups. If we look in the Balkans, for instance, there's been training provided to separatist groups on paramilitary tactics. So trying to take activist groups and either radicalize them or make them potentially violent. The funding of sort of Russian government-aligned think tanks is something that, again, we see across the European space. But in one of these cases, with a network of think tanks called the Dialogue of Civilizations, they've now said they're interested in opening one up in New York. And so I think that, again, this is something that we need to study what happens in Europe so we can understand what happens here. Jamie mentioned earlier, the profusion of some of these tactics or the use of them by other actors. And I think, we're really starting to do more work on Chinese operations and some of these tactics as well. Also are ones that we see the Chinese government and its proxies using, as well as what we call malign finance, which again is using these different covert pathways or coercive pathways to provide financial support to different organizations. And again, here, here you can see, where we've seen this across the transatlantic space. One of the examples that, again, combines some of these tools that we saw in the United States here was the case of Maria Butina, who was ostensibly a student at American University who was receiving covert funding from a Russian oligarch, and in order to carry out influence operations, basically being able to make connections with influential U.S. political figures and even presidential candidates. And the last point, the last tool that we look at, which Jamie mentioned, is strategic economic coercion, and this is using energy and sort of Russian energy networks, in particular in the European space, to be able to manipulate either getting particularly influential individuals to carry the Kremlin's water, but in another instance, which has just broken in the past week out of Italy, there's evidence that an energy deal that was being brokered in Italy was actually being used to funnel money secretly to one of the illiberal populist groups in advance of the European Parliament election, so that there was a $3 million euro kickback that this group was going to be receiving covertly through energy deals. So the nexus of this toolkit is really something that we think is important to think about in terms of how all of these operations are carried out in combination frequently with other tools. And just to kind of pan back out for 1 second in there, I think a couple of important takeaways that Jamie and I have from the sort of strategic perspective of these operations is, number one, as Jamie mentioned earlier, it's, this isn't partisan. The Russians aren't deciding that they're Republican or Democrat. If they are engaging, it's to the goals that Jamie outlined earlier. It's not just about elections. We talk a lot about this in the context of election interference, and I think election interference is one subpart of democratic interference. But I think it's one target of opportunity as part of a broader strategy. Elections are one of the most important institutions in a democracy, and it's a time when people are particularly focused on politics, but it's not just that. And I think therefore it's also important. We get a lot of questions sometimes about what was the impact on an election outcome, and I would say that's the wrong measure. The game being played here is a much bigger and longer game. We talked about the fact that it's not just social media, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. We saw that it's not just aimed at the U.S. It's a real broader transatlantic strategy in the Russia case. And of course, it's not just Russia. So I think we're probably getting short on time, but we can do a little bit of an overview of our policy recommendations, and then we can move on to some discussion.
Sure. And I'll just start, and then Laura can wrap up. As Laura described, partly because we do see this as a toolkit, we have seen, at least in 2016 in the U.S., and even in the subsequent debate about this, we have these stovepipes, certainly within government. We believe at the end of the day, this problem is not going to be addressed entirely by governments. We advocate for what we call a whole of society approach. And so in the blueprint, which I think is hidden because the Adobe needs to be updated, But we put out a
So it's Moscow hacking your
Yeah,
presentation.
Yeah.
we put out something a number of months ago called the Policy Blueprint for Countering Authoritarian Interference in Democracies. We're actually working our team right now on a kind of outgrowth of this that's going to be Europe specific in the run up to the the EU parliamentary elections here in a couple months. But we lay out basically recommendations for almost all segments of society. At the end of this day, and we've tried to look a little bit at some of the debates post 9/11 about how you bridge the divide on homeland security between foreign and domestic threats. I think there's some of that needs to happen on this issue too, although honestly I think this may even be a deeper problem because at the end of the day, as we've looked at the lessons learned, certainly in the U.S. and even European countries, a lot of it about the response is closing off these vulnerabilities. And many of those vulnerabilities are not, some of them are related to government policy, some are just societal vulnerabilities. And so you really need a whole of society conversation about this problem. You need to educate society about the threats. You need to provide, your average citizens with certain tools to respond in terms of how they consume news and information. Much of that needs to start at a very young age because you get into education policy. You get into the debate about civics education in this country. So a lot of this is not going to be solved necessarily by people with our backgrounds who have mostly national security or Washington experience. Much of it is going to be addressed elsewhere in the country, in state capitals and local communities. And so we lay out a lot of suggestions along those lines in the report. At the government level, we do think there are a number of things that can be done both by the executive branch and by Congress on a bipartisan basis. Some of it in the executive branch really relates to better organization. We were struck in talking to people post-2016 about why some of these gaps existed. Honestly, I think some of it, again, was similar problems that we were revealed after 9/11 about how different agencies had organized themselves, a lack of clear leadership in certain agencies. We were hopeful for a while, I guess, that maybe some of that was going to be addressed at different points. We realized early on in this project, as we talked to different agencies, that task forces were sprouting up everywhere in every key agency. We became very concerned when we found out that many of the task forces didn't even know the other task forces existed.
We introduced them to each other in a few
and there
cases.
was some of that as we made the rounds. Now there's been our big recommendation in that front, and that's in the report. We really think there needs to be a hybrid threat center of some sort, probably within the DNI structure, similar perhaps to NCTC, with a link to an empowered policy lead at the NSC. And the lead at the NSC has also been lacking, and there's been a lot of debate about kind of who even within the NSC structure has the lead on this issue at various times. And our fear now, post-2018, if you just look at the messaging from the administration, is kind of they've been quick to basically claim 2018 almost as a success, that some massive hacking of the voter rolls or the actual elections infrastructure was avoided. They have, the DNI and DHS have admitted that there was ongoing foreign interference from a growing list of actors in the election. But we haven't seen this impetus within the executive branch to really set up a formal coordination structure, either at the policy level or at the intelligence community. And there have been some reports that some of the task forces have actually now been shut down that were created in the run-up to the midterm. So that's one major move from the executive branch. We also, in the report, and you can look at it on our website, describe things like deterrent messaging, which is a major challenge given the political nature of this debate in Washington and with President Trump himself not wanting to really embrace the findings of the rest of the government. We looked and talked to some of the people involved in 2016 from the Obama administration who also struggled with this challenge. Once you see signs that an election is potentially being interfered with, if you're sitting in the White House, do you tell the public? We feel that it's important to actually educate the public and make them aware. The Obama administration debated this extensively. They tried to go to Congress to get a bipartisan statement from the Gang of Eight, the top leaders of both parties. some of the Republicans objected because of the way it was worded. There's now a dispute about whether the Obama administration responded effectively to their concerns and whether something could have been put out. At the end of the day, though, there was not clear messaging in the run-up to 2016 from U.S. authorities about what they already knew was going on. So that was a problem, which is something we think needs to be addressed going into 2020. We support legislation along the lines of some introduced by my former boss, Senator Rubio, along with Senator Van Hollen, which would try to make this some of this a little bit more mechanical and take the politics out of it. So require the intelligence community to report to Congress and then release an unclassified version of that to the public almost immediately upon some sign of interference. And then in the aftermath of the election, have some sort of review, which the administration did after 2018 through an executive order. But to actually make the sanctioning or the punishment automatic after interference is discovered after an election. And again, that hasn't really happened. We now have an administration that's admitted there was interference in 2018, but they haven't quite decided what to do about it yet. And we're really worried about the lack of a clear deterrent message, clear punishment for ongoing meddling as we go into 2020. There are a few other pieces of legislation which I encourage you to look at. Some relates to the social media companies. We don't promote a whole lot of federal regulation in that space, but there are some, especially related to advertising, just making sure that the same political rules regarding advertising that apply to print and radio and TV are applied to social media, which is kind of a loophole that's emerged over the years that the Russians exploited. And there are a number of other areas related to securing the elections infrastructure. And the good thing from our perspective is on many of these issues, there are bipartisan bills that have been out there and had begun to gain some momentum in the run-up to 2018. They have ended up kind of stalling at the end of the Congress, partly because of the broader partisan gridlock, not really because of a lot of disagreement about some of these issues. And so we're hoping in the coming months that there'll be more progress made there quickly on the private sector and civil society. And private sector, we think that tech companies do need to take on much more responsibility. We've seen a lot of that happen already post-2016. There's been much more self-policing of their platforms. At the end of the day, they are the ones who have all the data and the ability to monitor what's going on their platforms. We've also seen some signs that there's better public-private partnerships between law enforcement, the FBI, and the tech companies, although that's always been a thorny challenge, especially in the post-Snowden era. But we think more of that needs to be done. There have been some major takedowns which seem to have occurred because the government actually approached the tech companies and gave them insight into things that the USG had seen coming into the country and then gave them enough to figure out what was going on in their systems. And so we think more of that needs to continue. And I mentioned a bit the broader civil society effort. At the end of the day, we do think a lot of this, and we've learned a little bit from talking to some European partners who are trying to tackle this by changing their education systems, by incorporating media literacy, digital literacy into various education campaigns, better civics education. Obviously in the U.S., it's one thing if you're in Sweden or Finland to say we need to promote media literacy. They do that at the national level. Every child suddenly gets that sort of training. Here, it's really literally a state-by-state, or in some cases, a community-by-community effort. And so we've begun to talk to some organizations that are already engaged in some of those debates at the local level. But we do think there needs to be much greater awareness at the public. And the thing we always emphasize is just ask questions about information you see online. People need to understand that, especially when it comes to political speech or certain views that they're getting presented with, they should be asking questions both of the companies. What is your algorithm? Why is my news feed highlighting this thing but not that other thing? They should ask questions about the source of information, especially if they don't know the person pushing it out there. If people kind of stop, take a breath, and actually question some of this information, a lot of it will have less impact because it'll reach fewer people if it's not retweeted or pushed out to a broader audience as much. We like to highlight Texas Congressman Will Hurd, who was at one of our events, and I don't know if he had been using it before, but he described this as the new stranger danger, which we need to teach our kids about, where every parent teaches their kids about stranger danger and not to go up to strangers in the mall or to accept rides from strangers. Why in the world do we think it's okay to engage in political debates with strangers online? We have no clue who they are. We have no clue what their ultimate agenda is. We have no clue where they live or whether they're even American. And so the conversation needs to be framed in that way a little bit more. So I'll turn it over to Laura to fill out any final recommendations she wants to highlight.
Yeah, I think maybe we can leave the going into more detail on these for Q&A. But I would just two last points on pieces that Jamie highlighted. I mean, there's a lot that government can and needs to do here, government at all levels, but this is not a purely government solution, especially when it comes to some of the actions that I think are necessary from the technology side. I think number one, there's important speech implications to the government getting involved, and this is one area where there's a lot of differences with Europe. I think a lot of the European approach has been around content regulation, and that's certainly not something that we think the U.S. government should be engaging in. But I'm really concerned about the evolution of technology. So it's not just about sort of, again, what's happening now, but when we think about the way that AI is going to change a lot of the different technological tools. There's a lot of discussion about things like deep fakes, for instance, that are manipulated audio and video technology that is sort of indistinguishable to the human eye. And I'm quite sure that that's just one of the many things that's coming down the pike that's going to make a lot of this look like child's play. So we need to get ahead of the curve on technology and be thinking much more ahead about what are the downside risks of things before they actually come off the production line, so that they can't be exploited against us before we realize that. And then that last piece that Jamie was talking about is the resiliency piece. It's one of the biggest findings from a lot of research done across Europe. And even if we look back to the use of these tactics in the Cold War, that building resiliency in any population, inoculating against these threats, is going to be one of the most effective ways of reducing their effectiveness. We're never going to stop most of this activity. We can deter a lot of it. We can harden our defenses. But if we make ourselves more resilient, they'll be less effective.
Thank you very much to both of you. Absolutely fascinating, very informative, and really, really strategic. So thanks for all the good work you're doing gathering this information in Washington, and thanks for doing this roadshow coming out here to Texas to share this with us as well. So I'll just put one or two questions to you, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. The first one, I'm struck that all of this, the information you've gathered, is open source. This is unclassified. Tell us more about how you've been able to, kind of the methods you use, how you're able to gather all of this. How confident are you in these findings, and the fact that it can be discerned so readily, I guess, in an unclassified setting, what the Russians and Chinese and others are up to?
We spent a lot of time diving in on the open source side, as you note, and on some fronts you can get pretty far on the open source, right? So on the information operations side, some platforms are more easily accessible than others. So Twitter, because of its open API, we can actually do a good bit of research directly on Twitter. There's certain things you can't totally get to without what they call full fire hose access, and that Twitter can only internally see, but it's you can do a good bit of research on it. Reddit similarly has the ability to do a little bit more there. On the other hand, Facebook is pretty impossible for researchers to do much work on, just given the nature of Facebook and the fact that Facebook has decided not so far to make information available to researchers. And if we look, a lot of the research that we've done on the tracker, actually, the data that you saw highlighted on those maps, a lot of that was the really good work of investigative journalists and researchers at think tanks on frontline European states on the periphery. And so we had a lot of partnerships in building that data. We had a fabulous army of interns that were fluent in 8 different languages that translated a lot of reporting that had never seen the light of day in English, so that we were really able to go through and scrub and discern patterns and surface things that just were kind of out there. But again, it's this matter of putting the whole picture together. There's a lot of information that's out there, and it's just a matter of kind of piecing it together.
Yeah, I think what we found early on, especially on Russia, is there was this network of researchers in a lot of European countries doing country-specific work in their local language that maybe they weren't really even focused on the U.S. audience at all. And so by building relationships and then having people who could translate, we were able to get into that. I do worry a little bit on the China front, that although this is a rapidly growing space, and you do have a lot of good researchers in places like Australia, New Zealand, looking at what China is doing in their countries, Europe is not as focused on the China challenge right now. And the number of researchers in Europe who really know China is incredibly small. And understand these tactics is incredibly small. And so that's one area where I think we're looking to build more partnerships just to look at the way some of these other actors operate. If you look at some of the things we mentioned, like the Gulf partners, the Saudis, Emiratis, there's very few people who are really even looking into that whatsoever. And so it's really been through some, I think, mainstream news reporting and some leaks to them that we've been able to discover this. The final thing is, honestly, the investigations in Congress, despite at least one of them kind of going off the rails at a certain point, the Senate intelligence investigation has been incredibly useful to outsiders like us by just putting information into the public domain. I mean, they've held multiple hearings. Laura's testified in front of them, but also just getting some of the examples we had on these slides. A lot of that is because on a bipartisan basis, they have doggedly pursued this with the companies. Some of that's been helped as well by the Mueller investigation because Mueller, in his indictments, has shown many examples, specific examples, and provided other information that was not in the public domain. And so almost every time there's been a Mueller indictment, it's been very helpful to people like us as well because of all the information that he has had access to and his team has had access to and then has released
Putting
to the
out the
public.
breadcrumbs for GMF to pick up and follow. So, well, since you mentioned China, follow up my next question before we turn it over to the audience. So please, audience, have your questions ready. Most of your presentation today was, for understandable reasons, focused on Russian activity, but you brought up China a few times. Have you seen yet any evidence of Russian and Chinese cooperation in this space, either technology sharing, method sharing, joint active measures to screw around in American democracy?
Jamie's laughing because it's actually a point that we debate. So if you want to see us disagree on something, here we go. No, I mean, what I would say is I think we don't really know the answer to that, but I think it's an enormously important question, and it's one I'm actually kind of obsessed with looking into for this reason. I think at the strategic level, there's no question that there is an alignment of Russian and Chinese interests in a certain narrow band. That band may be expanding in part because of U.S. withdrawal from global leadership, in part from broader geopolitical shifts. I think, what used to be thought of as the sort of tactical one-off marriage of convenience between Russia and China may no longer be exactly sort of what the picture is. When it comes to the kind of tactical level cooperation that you're talking about there, I think I have seen signs that there are reasons to be concerned that there is some sharing of information about tactics and what may or may not be effective. I think that it remains to be seen whether those are very specific cases from which we shouldn't draw too broad of conclusions, or whether that is a harbinger of more things to come. I do think there are some interesting investments that are happening right now between Chinese and Russian companies, particularly on the tech and data front. So there's been a lot of focus recently on joint Russian and Chinese naval exercises, but at the same time that those exercises were occurring, the largest single Chinese and Russian joint investment in the tech space was signed and sealed. So I think it's really important to be keeping an eye on those things, especially when it comes to things like that will provide an ability to share both technology and data. But I'm probably a little more in the camp of I think something is afoot and we better figure it out. But
Jamie's always been a bit soft on China. Jamie, will you defend yourself here? So, okay.
I think the interesting thing for me is actually I've heard this question more and more in the last even few weeks. On a recent trip through Europe, a number of European governments officials that I met with raised this with me and said they were looking into it and started to see signs. The concerning thing for me is we haven't really. There are a few examples here and there where you can maybe make the argument. I haven't seen a lot of those. I think some of it may just be, and this is our worry about the proliferation of these techniques, is everyone's looking at what Russia did now in 2016, and it's good that we have a lot out in the public domain, but the downside of that is anyone can really look at the tactics, learn from them, adapt them to their own purposes. And so I'm sure the Chinese are analyzing what just happened. We have seen and you and I were in Taiwan together a few months ago. In places like Taiwan and Hong Kong in particular, in Mandarin-speaking political environments, they are already and have been for a long time conducting some of the same sort of operations that the Russians have been doing in Europe and here in terms of actually trying to weigh in on political issues, to push different narratives. The question for me, and we've seen some of that as well in places like Australia and New Zealand, I really wonder, though, the Chinese can afford to play a very long game. They can afford to use other tools now. I wonder whether they would want to risk a lot of their long-term gain by being so blatantly interfering so blatantly in American politics in the way that the Russians did right now. Part of that, though, is the question of deterrence. Do they feel that there will be any repercussions? If they don't think there'll be repercussions, I think sure. The Trump administration tried to make a big deal about supposed Chinese interference in the 2018 midterms. They never really released anything beyond, I think it was an ad in the Des Moines Register that was purchased very overtly by the Chinese to back that up. And so I also think we need to be a little bit careful about not making too much of this, because I think my fear actually is that the Chinese may use some of the same tools, but use them differently. One of my pet fears, with not a lot to back it up, is actually that they're going to use overt propaganda and overt messaging much more effectively than the Russians, partly because if you look at RT and Sputnik does not present a compelling vision of an alternative to U.S. or democratic leadership. Whereas China, and I've seen this in our GMF's Asia work in Europe, China actually goes into Europe and tries to give the Europeans some alternative, whether it's on climate change policy, on multilateralism. They will try to embrace the German government's idea of alliance of multilateralists. And the Chinese will say, okay, we're multilateralists too. We'd love to join this alliance of multilateralists. Look at your American allies. They hate your alliance of multilateralists. They're much more sophisticated in actually trying to exploit some of the divisions within democracies and present a compelling alternative vision, which I really don't think for the most part that is what Vladimir Putin and the Russian goal. They, for the most part, try to play spoiler, try to confuse, try to just present 10, as we talked about, 10 different conspiracy theories about different issues. Whereas I think the Chinese actually feel, especially right now, given the strategic landscape and questions about American leadership, that they actually have a potential alternative vision that is appealing to some people living in democracies, and maybe even appealing to some Americans eventually. And so I think they have some leeway there and some potential that the Russians do not have, and so they might adapt their tools accordingly. But this is an issue that is being hotly debated by everyone in this space right now. Yeah.
I think about this in the sense, too, of even if there's not overt cooperation, there's no question that the Chinese are benefiting from what the Russians are doing, right? So if the Chinese Communist Party sort of has a long-term goal of remaking the liberal democratic order in a way that is beneficial to the CCP's interests, it is able to do that better with a weakened liberal democratic order. And Russia is totally sort of leading the charge on the weakening of that. And so it creates a much easier playground for the CCP in the longer run. And so I think in a way, the CCP strategy is riding the coattails to an extent and then just coming in where they need to.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our guests. Thanks again to everybody for coming and for listening today. Please do check out our other podcasts at tnsr.org.